There is a moment in archaeology that almost never happens. Most of the work is slow, it is careful, and it is repetitive, and it is mostly about confirming things people already suspected. You dig, you record, you measure, you publish. The finds fit into categories that already exist. A pot that looks like other pots. A tomb built the way tombs were built. The picture gets a little sharper, a little more detailed, and the field moves forward by inches. And then, occasionally you open something, and there is a thing inside it that should not be there. In November of 2025, a team of Spanish archaeologists working in central Egypt opened a tomb they had labeled Tomb 65 in a part of the site designated Sector 22. Inside was a mummified body from the Roman period, roughly 1600 years old. That in itself was unremarkable. This site has produced a great many Roman-era burials. What was remarkable was sitting on the corpse's abdomen, a small clay packet, sealed, deliberately placed, and inside that packet, folded, a fragment of papyrus. When they read it, the fragment turned out to be a passage from the Iliad. Homer, the single most copied, most quoted, most memorized poem in the entire Greek world, placed inside the body of a dead person in Egypt on purpose as part of the process of preparing them for burial. Nobody had ever documented that before, not once. In more than a century of excavating Egyptian mummies, and we have excavated a very large number of them. This is the first recorded case of a work of literature being used this way. Not a spell, not a prayer, not a funerary formula from the Book of the Dead, a poem. And the obvious question, the one the researchers themselves are still working on, is simply, why? I want to be honest with you about something at the start because I think it matters. There is no confirmed answer to that question, not yet. Nobody is going to hand you a tidy solution at the end of this video because the people who actually excavated this burial do not have one either. What they have are the physical facts, the historical context, and a small number of serious hypotheses. But the reason this is worth an hour of your attention is not the answer. It is what the question opens up. Because to understand why a poem inside a corpse is strange, you have to understand what Egyptians normally put inside corpses. To understand why this poem, you have to understand what the Iliad meant to a person living under Roman rule in the 4th century. And to understand why it survived at all, you have to understand the site it came from, a place that has quietly taught us more about the ancient world than almost anywhere else on Earth. So let's take it apart properly. Start with the place, because the place explains a lot. Oxyrhynchus sits about 100 miles south of Cairo, in what is now the Minya Governorate, near the modern town of Al-Banasa. In antiquity, it stood on a branch of the Nile, a canal, now dry. And it was, by the standards of the ancient Mediterranean, a completely ordinary town. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it is the whole point. Oxyrhynchus was not Alexandria. It was not a center of imperial power or a great port. It had no wonder of the world, no famous library, no monument that travelers wrote home about. It was a provincial, administrative town of middling size, the kind of place where people filed paperwork, argued about property lines, ran small businesses, and got on with their lives. And that is precisely why it became one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. Because ordinary towns generate ordinary documents, enormous quantities of them, receipts, tax records, private letters, shopping lists, contracts, complaints to local officials, schoolboy exercises copied out and corrected, petitions, horoscopes, loan agreements, wills. The endless paper residue of a society that wrote things down. In Oxyrhynchus, that paper was papyrus, and when a document had outlived its usefulness, the people of the town did what people have always done with paper they no longer need. They threw it away. They threw it away for centuries. And because the town sat at the edge of the desert, in one of the driest climates on the planet, the rubbish heaps they created did something that rubbish heaps almost never do. They preserved everything. Papyrus is organic. In damp conditions, it rots, and it rots fast, which is why we have lost so much of the ancient world's writing. Most of what survives from Greece and Rome came down to us through a chain of medieval copying. monk after monk transcribing texts by hand for 1,000 years. If a work fell out of that chain, it vanished. That is why we have 7 complete plays by Sophocles when he wrote over 120. But in the desert sand of Middle Egypt, papyrus does not rot. It desiccates. It becomes brittle. It fragments. It can be crushed and torn. But the ink stays, and the words stay for 2,000 years. So beneath Oxyrhynchus, buried in mounds of ancient garbage, was an intact cross-section of a working ancient town's written life. Nobody knew that until 2 young men from Oxford went looking. In 1896, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, both in their 20s, both classicists rather than trained field archaeologists, began digging at the site. They were not searching for monuments or treasure. They were searching explicitly for paper. What they found is difficult to convey in scale. They excavated hundreds of thousands of papyrus fragments. Not hundreds, not thousands, hundreds of thousands. The material was shipped back to Oxford in crates, and the work of reading, cataloging, and publishing it has now been going on continuously for over 125 years. It is still not finished. There are boxes that no scholar has yet opened. Among the administrative debris, they found literature that had been considered permanently lost. Substantial portions of plays by Menander, a comic playwright whose work had been enormously popular in antiquity and had then disappeared almost entirely from the manuscript tradition. Poems by Sappho, of whom we possess almost nothing complete. Fragments of lost tragedies. Early Christian texts, including gospel material that does not appear in the New Testament. Works of history, philosophy, and medicine that existed nowhere else on earth. And Homer. An enormous quantity of Homer. This is the detail that becomes important later, so hold on to it. Of all the literary papyri recovered from Egypt, not just at Oxyrhynchus, but across the country, no author appears anywhere near as often as Homer does. He dominates the record, not by a small margin, by an overwhelming one. Copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey, complete and partial, turn up again and again and again in every kind of context. Professional book hands, cheap copies, student exercises, scraps reused for other purposes. If you wanted a single statistic to describe the literary culture of the Greek-speaking Mediterranean, it would be that one. Everyone had Homer. Everyone. To a modern reader, that can be hard to feel. We have a vague sense that the Iliad is important, a foundational text, a classic, something taught in universities. But important classic is not the same thing as what Homer actually was to a person in the ancient world, and the difference matters for understanding Tomb 65. Here's the thing. In the Greek-speaking world, Homer was not simply the greatest poet. He was the substance of education itself. Learning to read meant learning to read Homer. Children copied lines from the Iliad to practice their letters. Well, we have those exercises on papyrus, complete with the teacher's corrections. As students advanced, they memorized longer and longer passages. Rhetorical training used Homeric episodes as raw material. Philosophers argued about Homeric ethics. Grammarians built entire careers on Homeric vocabulary. To be an educated person in the Eastern Mediterranean under Roman rule was in large part to be a person who knew the poems. And knowing them was not a private pleasure, it was a social signal. Quoting Homer accurately in the right context told the people around you something about who you were, your schooling, your class, your cultural allegiance. It marked you as a participant in Hellenic civilization, which, in a place like Roman Egypt, was a distinction that carried real weight. Because Roman Egypt was a stratified, layered place. There was the native Egyptian population with its own language, its own religion, its own thousands of years old traditions. There was a Greek-speaking urban class, descended in part from the settlers who arrived after Alexander's conquest, and in part from Egyptians who had adopted Greek culture. And above both, there was Roman administration, Roman law, Roman taxation. These categories were not sealed off from each other. People moved between them, families intermarried, names got translated. A man might have an Egyptian grandmother, a Greek education, and a Roman legal status all at once. But the categories still mattered, and Greek education was one of the clearest ways of asserting where you stood. So, when we find a Homeric text in a burial, we are not just finding a book. We are finding a marker of identity in a society where identity was complicated and contested and worth asserting. Now, which part of the Iliad was it? The fragment in Tomb 65 comes from Book 2, from a section known as the Catalogue of Ships. If you have read the Iliad, you probably remember the catalogue, and there's a reasonable chance you remember it as the part where the poem slows almost to a halt. It is a list, a long one. It runs through the Greek contingents that sailed to Troy, region by region, naming the commanders, naming the towns they came from, and stating how many ships each contributed. Then it does the same, more briefly for the Trojan side. To a modern reader, it is an obstacle, the stretch of the poem you push through to get back to the story. Roughly 250 lines of names, places, and numbers. But the catalog meant something very different to an ancient audience, and understanding that is important here. For one thing, it was old. Scholars have argued for a long time that the catalog preserves geographical information considerably older than the rest of the poem, that it reflects, at least in part, a Bronze Age political map that no longer existed by the time the Iliad was written down. Some of the towns it names had ceased to matter or ceased to exist by the classical period. Reading it was, for a Greek, a little like reading a map of a vanished world. For another, it was a proof of memory. In a culture where the poems were performed and memorized, the catalog was the hard part. Anyone could recall the famous scenes in the duel, the quarrel, the death of Hector. The catalog was the section that separated genuine mastery from casual familiarity. It was long, it was intricate, and it had no narrative momentum to carry you through it. You either knew it or you didn't. And for cities across the Greek world, it was a claim to ancestry. If your town appeared in the catalog, that meant your ancestors had been at Troy. Communities cited it in arguments about status and territory, sometimes centuries after the fact. So the passage found in Tomb 65 was not a random slice of the poem. It was the section that most directly connected a reader to the deep past, to the oldest layer of the Greek world's memory of itself. I want to be careful here. We do not know that this specific quality is why that passage was chosen. It may have been chance, a fragment of a damaged scroll, whatever happened to be at hand. But it is a striking coincidence, and it is the kind of detail that makes researchers pay attention. To see clearly why this find is unprecedented, you have to know what Egyptian burial practice actually looked like, because it was not improvised. It was a system, refined over thousands of years, with a specific logic. The core belief is straightforward even if the details are elaborate. Death was a transition, not an ending. The person continued, but they had to get through a dangerous passage first, and the objects placed in and around the body existed to help them survive it. So you find amulets, large numbers of them placed at specific points on the body according to rules that were written down and followed. The scarab over the heart, the jed pillar for stability, the eye of Horus for protection and wholeness. Each one had a defined function, and the placement was not decorative, it was operational. You find texts too, but the texts are of a very specific kind. What we call the Book of the Dead is really a collection of spells. The Egyptians called it something closer to the Book of Coming Forth by Day, and each spell had a job. There were spells for passing gates, spells for answering the questions of hostile guardians, spells for the weighing of the heart when your deeds were measured against the feather of truth, spells for preventing your own heart from testifying against you. These were functional documents, magic in the strict sense, words intended to produce an effect. You find Shabti figurines, small servant statues meant to perform labor on the deceased's behalf in the afterlife. You find food offerings, jewelry, sometimes tools or objects associated with the person's profession. The specifics varied enormously across 3,000 years and across social classes. An elite burial in the New Kingdom looks nothing like a modest Roman period one. But the underlying principle held? Everything in the burial was there to do something. And that is exactly where the Iliad does not fit. The Iliad is not a spell. It has no function in Egyptian funerary religion. It does not address Osiris or Anubis or Thoth. It makes no claims about the judgment of the dead, offers no protection against the demons of the underworld, provides no instructions for the soul. It is a Greek poem about a war between Greeks and Trojans composed centuries before this burial, in a religious framework entirely separate from the one that governed Egyptian death rites. By the ordinary logic of Egyptian burial, it should not have been there. I want to be precise about what is and isn't new here, because it would be easy to overstate this, and the researchers themselves have been careful about it. Greek texts in Egyptian burial contexts are not new. Roman period Egypt was thoroughly bilingual, and we have plenty of evidence of Greek language and Greek culture intersecting with Egyptian funerary practice. Mummy portraits, the extraordinary painted panels from Fayum, showing faces that look startlingly modern, are exactly this kind of hybrid: Egyptian mummification, Greco-Roman portraiture. Papyrus and mummies is not new either, though for a reason that will make anyone who cares about ancient literature slightly ill. In the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, waste papyrus was sometimes recycled into cartonnage, a material a bit like papier-mâché made from layers of scrap paper and plaster used to make mummy casings and masks. Some of the most significant literary discoveries in the field have come out of dismantled cartonnage, which means ancient people used old copies of literature as construction material for coffins, and we recover the text by taking the coffins apart. But that is the crucial distinction. Cartonnage is recycling. The papyrus is there because it was cheap and available, not because of what it said. The words are incidental. Nobody chose that text. Tomb 65 is different in exactly the way that matters. The papyrus was not structural. It was not part of the casing. It was folded, placed in a clay packet, sealed, and positioned on the abdomen of the body. One of the most significant locations in Egyptian funerary practice, over the region where the internal organs were removed and where protective amulets were typically laid. That is not recycling. That is a deliberate act of placement in a location that carried meaning, performed as part of the ritual of preparing this specific person for burial. Someone chose this text. That is what makes it a first. So, we arrive at the question, and at the 3 lines of thinking the researchers have put forward, none of them is confirmed. I'll give you each one, and I'll tell you what I think its weaknesses are, because I would rather you finish this video with an accurate picture than a satisfying one. The first explanation is identity. This is the most straightforward reading. The person in Tomb 65 belonged, or wanted to belong, to the Greek-educated class of Roman Egypt. Homer was the defining marker of that identity. Placing the Iliad in the burial was a final assertion of who they had been, a statement, made at the moment when statements stopped being possible that this person was educated, was Hellenic, was part of that tradition. This fits the historical context well. It fits what we know about how ancient people used cultural markers to signal status. It requires no unusual assumptions. Its weakness is that it is almost unfalsifiable. It is the kind of explanation that would fit almost any Greek text in almost any Roman Egyptian burial, which makes it hard to test against the evidence. It explains the find without being challenged by it. The second explanation is protective or talismanic value. This one is more speculative, and the researchers have been appropriately cautious about it, but it should not be dismissed. In the ancient world, the boundary between literature, religion, and magic was considerably more porous than it is for us. Written words were understood to have power, not metaphorically, but practically. We have surviving amulets consisting of nothing but text. We have magical papyri that mix Greek, Egyptian, and Hebrew divine names into a single formula. We have evidence of Homeric lines specifically being used in divination, a practice where you would open the poems at random and read the resulting line as an answer to your question. That last point is the strongest support for this reading. There is genuine evidence that Homeric verse was used in ways that go beyond reading for pleasure or education. If the poem could function oracularly, it is not a large step to imagine it functioning protectively. The weakness is the specific passage. If you were selecting Homeric lines for magical protection, the Catalogue of Ships is a strange choice. It contains no gods intervening, no divine protection, no scene of rescue or survival. It is a list of place names and ship counts. It is difficult to construct a protective logic around it. The third explanation is personal. Perhaps this individual had a direct connection to the text. A teacher, a scribe, a professional copyist, someone whose working life was spent with Homer, for whom this passage was not a symbol of culture in the abstract but the actual substance of their days. Oxyrhynchus, of all places, makes this plausible. This was a town that produced an extraordinary volume of written material. Someone had to write it. There were scribes, there were teachers, there were people who copied literary texts professionally. The Catalogue of Ships, the demanding passage, the one that proved real mastery, would be a fitting thing for such a person to be buried with. The weakness here is obvious. We have no evidence for it. No name, no inscription, no professional equipment in the tomb, nothing that identifies the occupant's occupation. It is a possibility that fits, not a conclusion that is supported. And there is a fourth option that has to stay on the table, which is that the explanation is something nobody has thought of yet, a practice we have no other evidence for because this is the first example we have found. It is worth being explicit about the size of the gap here because it is large. We do not know the name of the person in Tomb 65. We do not know their age at death or, as far as has been published, their sex. We do not know their occupation, their religion in any detailed sense, their family, or their status. We do not know whether they could read the text that was placed on their body or whether the choice was made by someone else. A family member, a priest, an embalmer, working to instructions. That last point deserves more attention than it usually gets. We instinctively assume the deceased chose this. But Egyptian burial was arranged by the living. The people who prepared the body made decisions, so the Iliad fragment might tell us what this person valued, or it might tell us what their family wanted to say about them. Those are different questions, and the evidence does not currently distinguish between them. We also do not know whether this was unique or ordinary. That sounds like a strange thing to say about a find described as unprecedented, but consider how archaeology actually works. What survives is a tiny, non-random sample of what existed. Papyrus survives in the dry conditions of Middle Egypt and almost nowhere else. The vast majority of Roman period burials across the empire have not been excavated, and of those that have, many were dug in periods when recording standards were poor, or robbed in antiquity, or simply decayed past recovery. So there are two possibilities, and they have very different implications. Either this was genuinely exceptional, a one-off act, particular to this person and this family, in which case it tells us about them specifically. Or it was a practice that existed more widely, and Tomb 65 is simply the first case where the right conditions preserved it and the right people were digging carefully enough to notice, in which case it tells us something about a whole culture of burial that we have been unable to see. We cannot currently tell which. The way that gets resolved is not by argument, but by more excavation, and by researchers now knowing to look for exactly this which they previously did not. That is a real consequence of this find, and it is easy to miss. Discoveries change what people look for. There may be Homeric fragments sitting in museum storage right now catalogued as unremarkable papyrus scraps from burial contexts that will be looked at again. Step back, and there is a larger point about Oxyrhynchus that this find sharpens. For a century and a quarter, that site has been quietly rewriting the history of the ancient world, and it has done so almost entirely through the unglamorous. Not tombs of kings, not golden treasure, rubbish, paperwork, and the everyday documents of people whose names would otherwise have vanished completely. Because of Oxyrhynchus, we know what rent cost. We know how people addressed their siblings in letters. We know what a schoolboy's handwriting looked like when he was bored. We know what ordinary people worried about because they wrote it down and threw it away and the desert kept it, and this find fits that pattern exactly. It comes from an ordinary provincial town. It concerns a person whose name we will probably never recover. And it tells us something that no monument or royal inscription could. that at least one individual in the 4th century believed a poem belonged in their body when they died. There is also the plain fact that this happened at all. Oxyrhynchus has been excavated, published, and studied since 1896. It is one of the most thoroughly worked sites in Egyptology. And in 2025, a team opened a tomb there and found something nobody had seen before, which should probably adjust how confident any of us feel about how much of the ancient world we have actually mapped. The honest answer is less than it looks. The picture we have is built from what survived, and what survived is an accident of climate, chance, and where people happen to dig. I want to end somewhere slightly different, because I have been thinking about this since I started reading about it. We do not know who this person was, but we know one thing about them with unusual clarity, clearer than we know most things about most ancient individuals. We know what they took with them, of everything available: amulets, gold, prayers, images of gods with a documented track record of protecting the dead. A poem was placed inside them. A poem about a war that had already been ancient when they were born, about a city that no longer existed, about men who died fighting over something that, by the 4th century, nobody could entirely remember the point of, and specifically, the part of that poem that is a list. Names of places, names of commanders, counts of ships. A catalogue of people who were there, written down so that they would not be forgotten by a culture that had already half forgotten them. There is something in that which does not feel as distant as 1600 years should feel. We still do this. People are buried with photographs. Music gets played at funerals because it meant something specific to one person. Letters go into coffins. Objects that carry a life get placed with the body that lived it. The materials change. We do not use papyrus, and very few of us memorize epic poetry, but the impulse looks unchanged. The sense that some words, some sounds, some images are not incidental to a life but constitutive of it, and that it would be wrong to leave them behind. Somebody in Roman Egypt decided that the Catalogue of Ships was that, for them, or for someone they loved. Then they folded it, sealed it in clay, and laid it on the body. 1600 years later, a team of archaeologists opened the packet and read it, which means the words did in the end survive, outliving the person, the town, the empire, and the language most of us now speak. We tend to assume that whatever we leave behind will be understood. It probably won't be, but something will be found, and someone will try, and they will be working with exactly as little as we are working with now.